Yes. Okay, so this is the seventh session of the Brain of the Firm reading group with General Intellect Unit. And this time we are talking about Chapter 7, Control Physiology. So following up on what was going on in the previous chapter, we were going to be talking about physiology. It says at the beginning of the section, the human body is perhaps the richest and most flexible, viable system of all. Besides, there's an extra advantage. All of us have bodies, and inevitably we have a good deal of insight into their characteristics. Most people know little, however, about how it all happens. For that reason, there has to be quite a lot of explanation about the physiology of the nervous system. You can see why I'm not too embarrassed about putting this forward. After all, any human being is likely to find his own neurophysiology interesting, whether he's studying management or not. You will find, though, that this book continuously compares the unfolding story of corporate regulation in the body with its manifestation in the firm. This process begins in Chapter 7. So we'll begin analogizing between the body and the firm in this chapter. If that is an acceptable term, because as far as I can tell, he's doing analogies here, but maybe I'm wrong. General comments about Chapter 7. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess the main thing in Chapter 7 is just to keep in mind, like what is literary metaphor, what is analogy, and like noticing the organizational invariance, as he said last week. I wasn't here for last week, so I don't know exactly what he talked about, but yeah, just making sure to keep that in your mind. Try not to reify the body example too much. Like, to do that, I kept the animal ecology example in my head and thinking about the meta system there to make sure I wasn't thinking too hard in the body direction, but
yeah, I mean, we have like three objects of reference, right? We have the computer, we have the human body, and we have the firm, and those are all in play in this chapter. So you can kind of try to find the structural similarities between them there. And then, yeah, if you want to talk about animal ecology, that's bringing in another level of thinking. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I likewise came away commending Dia for trying to like harmonize the language of cybernetics, biology, and management, because I could tell he was really trying to marry them together and explain them in a way that was digestible for anyone who didn't have those specific backgrounds. But I was ironically finding myself filtering out some information whilst trying to read paragraphs on how brains filter information. Yeah, so that was, I felt the care and effort that went into this chapter for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I felt kind of weirdly lost in this chapter because it was weird reading a description of brain physiology from the 70s and kind of being like, well, what do we know today? I don't know. Brett, go ahead.
That was exactly my point. Was it's hard to keep in mind that this was written in the 70s. Wiener's work, when he talks about the brain, is even more crazy because he talks about the left brain, right, main thing, and that sort of thing, and that we sort of like, well, how much of this is actually true today? But I don't think that matters really because he's using it as an analogy.
Yeah, Rudy, go ahead.
Yeah, on that point, I think there's a very interesting phrase where he says, like, you can see the brain as a computer, but it's really hard to see a computer as a brain.
Yeah, I thought that was one of the most interesting points that he brings up in this chapter. That, yeah, like initially people tried to think about computers as brains, and that wasn't a very good mapping. But the inverse seems to be a much better mapping. So that's going to be interesting to explore. And I believe the point, well, we'll get to that. Like exactly why Beer says that's a problem. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, basically in terms of like what holds up. As far as I know, most of it is still basically like what we understand, including the part that we still don't really understand memory. Like, yeah, we maybe have like a better idea of like of how it works, but like we don't really get it.
Yeah, we still don't really understand memory. We still don't really understand sleep. We still don't really understand consciousness. These are all things that have eluded biology. And Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I would say that one of the most important parts of this is the concept of arousal, in the sense of when do the unconscious things wake up the consciousness? Because that's really going to be important when we get to the viable system model. Like, things should just be chugging away, doing what they do, and it shouldn't interrupt what's happening at the command level unless something's really wrong. And I think that's a problem that nobody gets right, is when do you arouse the command stack? And the thing that on page 95, where he talks about the three that there's three modes. There's test incoming data and recognize what action should be taken, test and recognize things that have to be filtered out, and store a record of those transactions. I work in hospital databases. There are times where you need to alert that a patient's going to die. And there's data that's happening in the pipeline that could say, wow, this person is really at risk for a bunch of factors. My software that my company makes will do things like, I think your patient is pre-diabetic, so I'm sending a text message to the PCP. And all of that stuff, again, ties into algedonics in the sense of, when the pain gets too high, shoot up the spinal cord. And the organizational version of that, I think that's some really crucial stuff in this chapter, is when do you do it? When do you ignore it? Because you have to ignore almost everything, or you just can't function.
Right. So just to kind of jump into the chapter a bit here, we initially get the sort of description of how the afferent and efferent systems map onto the body. We get the talk about the spinal cord and the sort of like lateral coordination as well as vertical coordination. I think that's quite important. I think the most interesting thing to me there was that the vertical connection through the spinal cord is very visible, but the lateral ones are much less visible. And similarly, I think in organizations, we have the same problem where the bottom to top connections are often quite articulate, and the lateral connections are very unclear. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, this stuff's very important, right? Because I was especially struck by the description of like the spinal column as anastomotic reticulum, right? Like we still have this input, weird shit, output sort of pattern, right, going on. And when you think of it that way, like it's as you said, it's usually very obvious to think of the vertical alignment of that like, oh, it's as if there were two cables, one goes up to the brain and one goes down again. And that is a feature of the spinal column. But the way Beer describes it here is that like the two plates are actually the front and back of the spinal column as well, right? Like that there's this like input network output stuff all up and down going crossways, which is something that you don't usually think about, right? Like it very much reminded me of that the diagram of like the ideal vertebrate organism, which is a tube with like a front and a back side and stuff like that. And we tend to think of things in this kind of like lateral thing of like, there's the head and the tail ends, right? There's the cephalic kind of bias that we have. We tend to identify heads as being extremely meaningful. But there's also this kind of like partitioning front to back, like a crossways, which is usually not the kind of thing we pay attention to because it doesn't have that kind of like cephalic character to it. It's not head-like. We just have this weird bias in our senses of like paying attention to heads as being very important. But all this kind of cross-connection stuff tends to melt away for us often.
Right. So describing the sort of ideal vertebrate, I guess when you map that onto the human form, you have to take into account the way in which the brain sort of forms a part of a cycle. So it's not actually a terminus. The actual physiology, as opposed to the anatomy, is much more circular rather than vertical and, as you said, lateral. Yeah. Okay. Cool. That's an interesting point. Lauren, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think what Shane was saying to me really highlighted like the fruits that we got from the chapter we were promised in the chapter prior about how bad the org chart is, because the org chart doesn't have any of that in it. Like no connections laterally, that none of that to show like how everything's tied together, and like it really shouldn't, because it would be messy and hard to read. But it really illustrated and maybe reflect upon my experience working in organizations where you get that sort of anatomy of the org chart, so you know how it's set up, but then how much compensation has to go into that lateral communication, like through onboarding. Like I remember sitting down with like the HR person who was like, okay, so this is how you need to talk to this boss, and this is how you need to talk to that boss, and this is how you need to talk to that boss, and like this is who you need to go do for this. And it's like there's just so much like to compensate for that that's very inefficient. And a lot of it is like sort of internally held onto, and that's where we get those issues of people in the previous chapter being in this organization for like 7+ years and having all of that internal knowledge, but it not being able to be replicated or repurposed in the org structure when they move on and stuff.
Right. Yeah, it's very like sort of not tacit, but unrepresented knowledges of coordination. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, just a quick comment on the org thing. I was once in an organization which didn't even have the like obvious who you speak to thing. It was a matrix organization. There was one person like that you were supposed to speak to, but it wasn't even clear who that was. So it didn't even have the benefit of like having the one like person above you in the tree.
Okay, so like it was like a network system, kind of like it was structured like a starfish or something. It
was like a rigid network, basically.
A rigid network. It's like Beer's net example in the Designing Freedom thing.
Yes.
All right, interesting. Okay, that sounds bad. Okay. So there's this whole discussion of anatomy that comes up next. I think one thing that is interesting and kind of gross about this discussion here is that Beer describes anatomy in very active terms. So like everything's kind of like growing and like folding and, swelling. And it's like the whole like sort of growth process of the human organism is represented in Beer's language, whereas we tend to like to reify these things in our typical descriptions of anatomy, maybe because it sort of like distances us somewhat from the reality of our own fleshy existence. But yeah, that was my only real takeaway from this was like, yeah, there's this really active process language that is quite unsettling. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. It's like the end of Akira or something. It just has this very unpleasant sort of character to it. There's something very interesting there, though, that like there's a kind of somatic realism to Beer's kind of thing, right? He kind of accepts the active and lively characteristics of matter, and that the organism is an extension of those characteristics. Like that matter is generally active, and it happens to take on this disgustingly active kind of character when it gets to this sort of level, right? I mean, I found this section was, I mean, a lot of the chapter is just kind of, it's all kind of familiar to us, right? But it is interesting how he kind of breaks down the structure of the brainstem, particularly is like, there's all these kind of like sub coprocessor bits, and it's sometimes a little bit clearish what they're sort of doing, but then there's all these kind of effects that emerge from the interaction of them where it's not really clear at all. So you're kind of like, I think, again, we have this kind of, typical way of seeing of like, okay, there's organs, then there's the spinal column, then there's the lower brain, midbrain, and high brain. Very linear. But even then, when you look at the kind of lower midbrain sections, they're kind of, cross-connected in strange ways, and it's not super clear that there's a kind of direct linear vertical pathway. So there's a lot of complication emerging here, and a lot of kind of like, well, this part seems to do this thing, and this other part seems to do another thing. But then when both of them act in conjunction with this other thing, a different thing happens, and it's all quite complex. I mean, I guess, is there much to really say about the kind of the physiology stuff here? I mean, I think it's probably all very familiar to us, right?
I think it may be interesting to revisit once we've looked at the VSM. Like, there's the whole mapping that Beer does at the end of this chapter of physiology onto 5 echelons, which is going to form the basis for the VSM. So I think returning to that may be interesting later on. But at this present moment, it is very first-year psych stuff. And I guess the only thing I had to say about that sort of like, interconnected nature of all these like subsystems is you can look at all as the other first year psych thing, which is looking at brain damage and compensatory responses by the brain, and how subsystem tasks can be like grown by other parts of the brain to some extent, not perfectly, obviously. Like, you have very severe spinal cord damage and you're screwed, right? Like that's not going to heal itself. But there are many parts of the brain that can take over tasks from other parts, and the brain is also like often like changing quite a bit over time too, in terms of what is emphasized, what aspects are powerful. So I like Beer's very like active descriptions here. Especially I like the way he describes how like the brain is sort of like extruded from the spinal cord. That was a very good way to emphasize the connection. Okay, let's go to Lauren and then Matt.
Oh, I think Matt was first.
Okay, Matt, go ahead. You're still muted, Matt.
Oh yeah. Have like a quick, like really like weird example of the plasticity there of like, so sometimes someone will get in some kind of accident, like they'll have some brain damage and then they'll slur their speech, but then they'll get a little bit more of that section removed because like there was scarring or whatever, and then they got enough damage for the brain to heal itself, and now they don't slur their speech anymore. Like it's that's something also that like, I feel like you could really explore with this framework that, that is still a mystery. Like that is not understood.
Yeah, it's kind of like a algedonic threshold is being tripped, and then the brain is activating a compensatory response. Maybe. At least for this framework, it seems that way. Lauren, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to get back to compensatory examples. Like, what really stuck out to me was every single year at this company I worked at, we would have a week or two on how to communicate with each other, because like we all secretly hated each other and like hated the job, so communication wasn't that fluid across like either laterally or vertically. And every year we would do like Myers-Briggs communication exercises to see how we can talk better to each other, and like some countless communication diagnoses to see how we could be more efficient. And that really, to me, I was like, oh my God, that was us really trying to compensate for our shitty structure, to find ways to like enhance those organizational filters to make sure information got to the right place in the most efficient way possible. That came to my mind. Sorry.
Yeah, like there is, like, you kind of get the sense in Beer's example how the filters, which is the next thing that comes up, like work to the benefit of the human organism. But of course, something we see in organizations very frequently is that the filtering is actually destructive. Famous example being in the Soviet Union. Lots of sort of micro filtering for sort of game theoretic logical outcomes for the actors, but at a system level is incredibly maladaptive. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this there's something interesting on page 92, like in kind of weaved in with this sort of thing before we get onto the filtering bit. That the notion that the cortex is isolated and the nervous system and the brainstem mediate between the body and the cortex. And that's very interesting, right? Because you've got like this information transference upwards from the organs and so on through the nervous system to the cortex, which is kind of in its own little pocket universe in a way. But that's kind of layered, right? Because you've got the question that, like, if the nervous system mediates information transfer into the cortex, what does the cortex mediate? And I think it mediates sociality, so that like information flows up to the cortex, and it's mediated on its way there. But then the cortex is its own mediation with a much wider, extended cognitive network, which is sociality. And I think there's kind of step changes of quality along the way there, right? Like, because this goes down to the cellular level even, right? Like, at each way we have this like aggregation of active matter engagements being mediated upwards into a different structure, which takes on a different kind of behavior. And I think that keeps on going. So that's worth kind of pondering, right? Like our cortexes are kind of the equivalent of the brainstem for mediating a kind of collective intelligence. That kind of jumped out at me there in amongst this sort of physiological description.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Many people hypothesize that our cortexes are as sophisticated as they are for social reasons, and I think that's probably a reasonable thing to state. But to view the cortex as the brainstem for the social, I think is a very good way to put it. Matt, go ahead.
I two things. One is that for like organizational stuff, like really thinking about how little like peer to how little horizontal connection there actually is, and like I think it's just that's probably if not necessarily intentional, like because how could you architect like that sort of thing? I think it's the result of the selective pressures prioritizing labor discipline over efficiency. And I remember the Chapo bit about how American suburban society was basically created to recreate, the French smallholding peasants in the 18th of Brumaire who don't, who everything is vertical. Well, like everything is hierarchy. You don't really have much peer to peer versus like factory workers who work alongside each other and talk to each other, and then go to the same bar together, and then go back to the same neighborhood. American society was created to be like very atomized because it's about maintaining command and control over necessarily being effective. What's its I forgot the second. Maybe I'll get back to it.
Yeah, definitely. And where does that leave us today? Even more atomized. My dad lives in the suburbs, and he at least knows the people on his street. It's real. There are a lot of like sort of levels of atomization, but I think your overall point stands for sure. And then Jake, you had something to add?
Yeah, I wasn't sure how relevant it was or not. That's why the hand kept going up and down. But on Shane's point about maybe sociality and cooperativity as being like the highest level, I don't know if exactly that was what Shane was saying, but like the highest level of reason, basically. I did an agent-based systems course once, and there was this like agent architecture called interop, and like cooperative planning is the very top thing. And there's this quote I have here just to quickly read. So the lowest layer deals with reactive, the middle deals with everyday planning, and the uppermost deals with like social interactions and cooperative planning, right? And then at each layer, you're supposed to represent like a specific knowledge base with different ontologies. So the lower level one has pretty like raw data. And then the top level one has like relational information about like this person loves this person, or, you know, like social things and how we cooperatively plan. And then the middle one is like everyday planning information. And so the lower one like says up like I need to delegate to you. And then of course, like the higher level, the social layer has like particular kind of ontological information that it can't act immediately on the world because it doesn't represent things at that level. So it has to speak down to the lower levels, like, translate this into like a plan of action, right? I have this broad goal of like form a union or whatever. And you just kind of imagine that, but in a brain. And then like pushing that down to like the lower level things. Different levels of abstraction for the different tasks, right?
I mean, that definitely maps with what we've been discussing so far. Absolutely. And especially that point about the upper level being essentially separated from any immediate contact. Okay, so let's move on. So we have the filtering discussion. You know, there is the discussion of how filtering is essential, because if we didn't have filtering, we couldn't function. There is the discussion of basically compression, data compression going up. And we have the discussion of the arousal function that Jeremy mentioned earlier. So what do people think about this part here? Shane, go ahead.
I thought the description, sort of like the lower half of page 93, was quite interesting, because you've got what is it? The first task is to inspect the information coming up to see whether it's appropriate to deal with at this level. So do you need to take action at this level, yes or no? And I've drawn out a little kind of decision chart in the margin notes here. But on the yes branch, you have two possible actions, which is issue action or pass along a modified version of the signal. And on the no branch, you have filter the signal or combine the signal with some other stuff, right? And you might think, hey, there's an obvious term there that's missing, which is to pass on an unaltered version of the signal, which is, I think the reason it's absent, or it tends to not happen very much, is that it's probably not all that useful, because I think on the way nervous stuff works is that other things can just tap into the same line. They don't actually have to, like, you don't have to pass the message along. But it's also worth calling back to the previous, I think it's chapter 5, with that shitty fucking machine that he made. But when we look at that machine takes in a high variety input. It takes in 10,000 possible states, and purely due to its structure, it reduces variety. Like it's not actually possible for it to not reduce that variety. Like it takes in 10,000 states and it spits out 16. I think that is always going to be true of these kinds of structure systems where the behavior is structural, that it's not actually possible for the thing to pass on an unmodified signal. Like purely by passing through the thing, it would alter the signal. So I thought that was kind of maybe one to call out there, because it jumps out as an obvious, hey, look, there's a missing option here, which is pass an unmodified one. I think these structural things always modify, and they have to, because if it didn't modify anything, then it wouldn't actually be there, right? Like if it's not doing anything, it's not actually present, you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's not, if it didn't reduce variety in some way, it wouldn't really be a structural function, according to what Beers described about structure. Matt, go ahead.
Because like the things that it's talking to, like it has to have like a lower, like a or really just a different kind of representation, probably like lower detail, and that's part of why like I just kind of turn away from any leftist stuff that is predicated on like mediation being the thing that we're going after. No, I mean like fundamentally, like there's no such thing as unmediated. Like it's in the very structure of your brain. And so, like anything that's talking about like mediation's the enemy, or you're like that's like the primary goal of a communist. Like that's no, that's nonsense. That's meaningless. Also, yeah.
I'm with you on that, definitely. And like I think it's at the very minimum. I think at its absolute limit, it would be like bouncing light off a mirror. That like at a very minimum, it will diminish the light signal somewhat simply because of the physical interaction. Like there's no way to have these things be actual patterns of matter in the world and not have them influence the information that's passing through them. So yeah, everything's mediated. Like if you're looking at light, it's mediated through your eyes and so on. It's just not really computationally feasible for things to be unmediated.
Lauren, go ahead, please.
I might be jumping in. I haven't read the other chapters. I'm very excited for them, though. Having read this one, since I bring that filtering back to like being in an organization, and how much that filtering, in my experience, has been very inherent or like learned on the job kind of thing, where you learn how people like to receive information, and then you can kind of like accommodate to suit. Thinking particularly of sort of like that vertical communication between sort of like subordinates and bosses. And how much easier that would have been if people had set expectations around like, okay, this is this is like what you need to say to the CEO. Like I had a CEO who said, I will not read an email if you do not include the action item in the first sentence. He hated getting emails that are like, hey, like, and I'm an ENFP. I'm like, hey, I hope you're well. Like just passing on this thing, and then like I'm very person forward, and he was like, I hate that, I don't like that, like I will not read your emails if you do that. And so that was like quite blunt but helpful for filtering expectations. So yes, very excited to see what the future chapters have to say about mapping that onto businesses and stuff.
Yeah, it is quite blunt, but it also makes sense that like assuming you have that kind of hierarchical structure of executives and staff and line and all that, like the executive cannot maintain a personal relationship with everyone in the organization. It's just structurally impossible. So that, maybe there's a problem with one person doing that executive task, and that needs to be examined. But it does make sense coming from their position why they would just want action items, because we only got so many minutes in the day.
Yeah, he would also be like, oh, I need you to flag if you're brainstorming with me, if you're coming to me with an idea, and like he'd sort of categorize like all of the things that you could bring to him. That was how I managed it. Yeah.
Right, and like Google has tried to do this with their like Gmail system, right, where they categorize emails for you automatically, because we're all kind of in that position of like being an information overload and needing some structure to what we get because there's just too much. Even though this is just our personal relationships, it doesn't have anything to do with being an executive. We're an executive of our own lives, I guess. So yeah. Anyway, internet stress. Yeah. So let's move on to there's a discussion of noise that we kind of didn't talk about, but I think it's okay.
Are we thinking like page 94 with arousal? That's probably the next big one.
Yeah, I mean, are there things here that... So maybe one thing to talk about is the bottom of page 94. We should not think of a filter simply as an inhibitor where it, by a lot of data, is stopped or reduced. It can also be a facilitator if it allows only certain kinds of messages to pass through and stops or inhibits the others. So that's exactly what Lauren was describing, right? Like, give me a message that's too noisy, and I'm going to shut it out. There seems to be no in sight. There's no special purpose nuclei so far defined. That's an interesting point that Beer dwells on quite a bit, is that we don't have a special subsystem for managing arousal. It's general to the system, whereas many of these other things are specialized. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, by reading Beer's writings around the year 2000, he begins to talk about holograms and saying that the consciousness is holographic and that therefore it's not located in any particular part, but it's distributed throughout the entire.
Yeah, that is very interesting to see both arousal and consciousness as having that property. Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the filtering process can also be thought of as translating between meta languages as well. Like in the example I gave earlier with the kind of reactivity layer that has its own meta language, right, which is low level, and then the social cooperative layer has its own meta language. And it doesn't have to be that kind of architecture, right? It could be more holistic, more interrelated and complex. But I was primarily thinking about meta language translation when I was thinking about filtering, but I guess it could just be reduction as well.
Yeah, I mean, that might be inherent to the ontology of the meta language, that it just can't understand a thing that might be parsable at a lower level, but would just appear as noise at a higher level. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the point about the meta languages is very good, right? That would definitely be, as you climb the ladder of meta languages, you're kind of losing detail or you're combining detail in different ways, right? But yeah, the whole thing of the filter not being an inhibitor, it's a facilitator thing, is very, very important, right? And I think it turns a lot of our kind of expectations on our head, especially when we get to the back two pages of this chapter, where he's going on about the just colossal variety of what's going on at the lower levels, right? There's so much happening that it's really impossible for it all to bubble up, right? And so we shouldn't think of the filters as the upper layers being denied the information they crave. In fact, it's a service being done that the lower levels are taking care of all that shit on their own, and you just don't need to know about it, right? So it's kind of pushing the orientation downwards, right? You're kind of valorizing the productivity of the lower levels and the sheer explosive variety of what that they handle, and not really craving an information flood to come upwards to you. It's you don't need the cortex to be aware very much for things to work,
Yeah, I mean, Beer certainly talks in Designing Freedom about how important that is, right? And saying we're designing computer systems wrong because they're trying, the managers are trying to get flooded with information, which is going to be completely useless to them. I guess with the caveat, what you said, with the caveat that this is a functional system, this is a viable system, because it's not a given that the filtering is necessarily working to the ends that the top would like. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's a tension between Beer's advice and how corporations actually run in late capitalism, where you see a lot of CEO speak, business school speak, saying, I wish our workers were more autonomous. I wish they knew exactly what to do and they just did their work without asking us and without guidance. But then when they do it, the control system completely freaks out at the terror of that idea that the workers can manage themselves. So there's this weird push and pull going on where there's a lot in the discourse about hire general purpose people who are generalists, who know how to do lots of things and wear lots of different hats. But when people do wear lots of different hats and are capable of doing lots of different things, there's a lot of pushback because of fundamental assumptions about how control is supposed to work in a corporation, which have really nothing to do with viability.
Right. Definitely. Shane, go ahead.
I just that's all exactly true, right? And I think it's I kind of like the kind of analogizing that goes on with the kind of like psychoanalysis stuff of like the bourgeois ideology is inherently paranoid. It's that corporations are paranoia machines, or that they're at their best they're kind of split between like a schizoid and paranoid model, where they're fragmentary but also like hypervigilant and panopticon like. It's just to say that like sort of mental illness can be instituted at higher levels than the individual. Right? There are pathological thought patterns that emerge in group settings that are kind of reflective of the pathological thought patterns we have as individuals.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. I think we need to dive into that a lot more. And hopefully we'll have an opportunity to later in this reading group. But yeah, it like that is an interesting phenomenon in terms of the sort of character of the corporate world and late capitalism. Because you might think that the original early capitalist consciousness would be more paranoid, more paranoid rather than schizophrenic. And it's a later development that it develops that kind of schizoid in the psychoanalytic sense mentality.
Mm-hmm. We're gonna have to read Anti-Oedipus someday, you know.
Yeah.
And so the whole damn books of that.
Yeah. Like, absolutely, is trying to understand post-68 society. So, okay, well, let's move on, Lauren.
Oh yeah, this is my gender comment of the week. I think this is where a lot of like sort of corporate gaslighting can come in. Like I've had experiences where the filtering system in a sort of that hierarchical institution has been used to really gaslight and like abuse people. Whether it's like a matter of, oh, this is your responsibility, like you're autonomous, you should be able to do it, and then you don't do it, and then you get punished for it, or that decision is like retroactively taken back during the process, or like there's no, like I'm now just processing where that corporate gaslighting comes from.
Right. Yeah, it's very much like having it both ways is the way that management seems to operate, where it's like autonomy when it's useful and subordination when it's useful, and the consistency of the application of those principles isn't thoroughgoing. It's what's really consistently applied is the convenient thing to do to maintain worker discipline. So, both of these things are used towards that end. Matt, go ahead.
Yeah, I think in a lot of cases, management just wants to be disciplining. Like, and so it is just, a purely contrarian, like, duck season, rabbit season type thing, where like, yeah, like no matter what you're going to do, like, because they think their job is to push you in one direction or another. There's actually no right move, And one of the things I've seen Beer and Taylor complain about actually is just that, managers like hearing about like a different way of doing stuff and then thinking like, oh, then like what am I even here for? Like, what are you even there for?
Yes. Sometimes that's a very good question, and one that they wouldn't want to dwell on too much. Okay, so moving on. We have the discussion about okay, and then there's that the 3 tasks that Jeremy mentioned earlier that are both a characteristic of the central command axis and of the specialized controllers. They all have to do this thing. Test incoming data, recognize any on which command action should be taken, take that action, and send on the original information suitably modified. Test and recognize any data that have to be filtered at this level, compressing, facilitating, inhibiting the ascending path. So essentially, I think, Shane, the third option that you were describing is the compression option. The pass-through option is the compression option, which is not to say you get a one-to-one, but you get a fair approximation of the input data.
You get the information you care about, right? Like you get some kind of compressed form, but it maintains the spirit of what you're actually after. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's like you have compression artifacts and stuff, but like your higher levels have the capacity to find the signal in the noise and aggregate that information, because they're probably getting similar data from many different sources, and then they can aggregate it just like, we do with whatever TV screens, right? Our eyes do that. Okay. So that's interesting, but it is, of course, nonetheless unmodified. Modified, not unmodified. Third Creed, you had something to say?
Yeah, you might have to do some. Oh, I'm so sorry. You might have to do some translation for me, because I may not be expressing this well, but I get it's a point of confusion. It's like when the lower orders are talking to the higher orders, they translate to it via, as Shane was describing, a structure that evolved, where, it somehow came to be, and like but so it's a character in the whole description that I'm often getting confused about, which is the operations researcher who is constructing the translation service. So like one of the pieces of knowledge is how to have a model of the higher order, or where the higher order gets its model of the lower order in order to send information. But that piece of knowledge isn't something that belongs either to the higher order or to the lower order. And I've never seen, or I don't understand at least how it's embedded into the system. Like, is it embedded? You know what I mean? Or like if I was going to translate from English to Spanish, for example, that's a special skill. It's English to Spanish translation. It's not either of those things. And even worse when I'm translating, if I was translating between, fish and birds or something, as those structures get more and more different, those special skills, where do they reside and how does the system think about them? And I'm not sure if it's entirely relevant here, but maybe you can make some sense of my question. And
yeah, like, I think that we can kind of see these things as sort of like inbuilt affordances of the higher layer in terms of like what senses they have, like what they can sense and recognize. That's already kind of the model. If we want to think about it, though, as an operations researcher and how they interact with this, I guess you have to think about like education as a kind of mutation, right? Like you mutate through your education into a kind of organism that sees these things. There's also that idea of meta languages, right, that Beer brought up earlier in the linguistic sense. So, Spanish to English is a translation that you can kind of improvise. If you have a knowledge of both of them, you can do interpretation. If you want to get to a meta language of those two, then you are probably going to be looking at something like linguistics, which is not itself a language. It's purely meta-linguistic. Well, not purely, but you can't learn linguistics and then use that as your language, and if you did, it would degenerate from being what it originally was. Okay. Anything other people have to say? I hope that was helpful. Jeremy, yeah.
Yeah, Beer talks about this in his first book, Cybernetics and Management, where he talks about a situation where you have, actually I've got it right open right here. So he draws a diagram of operational research, and he has a situation where there's one column that's real life, and there's a box called actual factors. And then there's another column that says control mechanism, and between actual factors reaches out to what the operational research model will be. And then there's also actual production, and that reaches out to the plan. And the idea is the operational research scientists look at the actual factors, and then they create a plan. And that plan goes and affects how actual production works. But then he throws in a curveball and says, okay, what happens if the plan gets altered after the operational research people leave? They don't know what decision-making went on to create the plan. They have no access to operational research, and by changing the plan, they've changed the entire structure. And the only way to fix that is to stick a black box between the model and the plan. And that black box is going to be written in a meta language this system cannot possibly understand. And, I think it's one reason why companies get stuck. And then their response is, let's hire someone from McKinsey to tell us what to do. They know what to do, but they don't have within their system what to do is undecidable. And so they create a meta language like McKinsey or Deloitte to come in and tell them something. They go, ooh, we paid McKinsey a lot of money. This must be the right thing to do. And that creates the black box for them. And you have to have that to create homeostasis. If you don't have it, things just fly off the rails. But it's a particularly unimaginative way to go about it by bringing in one of your typical consultants from one of those typical companies. You can do that in-house as long as you have an understanding of a meta language in there.
Yeah, just I think on a sort of, I think the other side of that, the sort of set of questions there about like the structure of like translation and like information propagation and how it gets reduced and so on. In this book, Beer is focusing on this biological analogy, but in the companion volume, Heart of the Enterprise, he actually goes with a slightly different take. And he uses the word transducer to describe a lot of these things. And transducers that we know in the world are like microphones and speakers and such. And they have information translation, like there's sound waves out there. They hit the microphone and they get translated or transduced, whatever the fuck, into electrical signals. And looking at those kind of physical examples, it's like, of course, because how could it not? It's the structure of the microphone that determines the translation. And it also determines the way that variety is reduced. Because, I mean, information is always lost in one of these transductions. You don't actually get a perfect replica of the sound waves. You couldn't possibly, because, again, look at the structure of the damn thing. But the structure of the thing determines how much information you get. Like, is the microphone a fucking piece of shit? Like, is it gonna sound terrible? Like, does it just not represent frequencies above a certain frequency and so on? Or like maybe a more crude example is like a cheese grater. Like a cheese grater is a structure. You push cheese through that, it's going to do a particular thing, and it does it purely immanently in its own structure. Now, human psychic and social systems don't have the kind of, I guess, the upside of just being immanently represented physically, but there's something similar going on there, right? That the structure of like what the person, as I think as Kyle mentioned, like the learning that they've had will determine a lot of the way they translate things, right? Like, so one of those goons from Deliot or whatever, these fucking consulting firms, is going to have a very particular take on things, right? Like variety is reduced in a certain way through this, that they're acting as a microphone. They're transducing information in very particular ways because of the structure their brain has taken on. So just keep the transducers in mind. That's basically what we're getting at here. That's like structure itself can do work for you by just pushing energy through it. If you push energy through a structure, it will transform that energy.
Yeah, it's like a river delta or something like that. I had something to say, but I'm going to pass it on to Rudy.
Just to talk a bit about what Jeremy was saying of McKinsey and other corporations, I think that the analogy is very useful. At the same time, I feel like McKinsey benefits from the fact that managers don't want to listen to their workers because it's an authority thing, and they regret losing that authority. While well-suited people coming in, while you're paying them millions of dollars to sign a bullshit report, is very different. There's still that authority of the rabble is kept down if McKinsey comes in and tells you what to do. I think BR really gets at in designing freedom lecture and say like, well, computers come up until it actually challenges authority, then they don't get used.
Right. This is like the historical materialist explanation for why we have priests, right? What you just described there, Rudy. So yeah, it's that halo or aura of authority that is sort of the representation of a meta language, inscrutable to the lower levels. Okay, well,
that was helpful. Appreciate it.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that was definitely a good conversation to have. Okay, so let's continue on there. We get to this discussion of memory, which was the third thing. Notably, memory isn't as in a, memory isn't really, as we often represent it in a computer, although that's this oversimplification of how computers work, stored in storage or memory, like the long-term hard disk storage, right? It's not like there's the memory spot and it goes in there and that's where all the memory is. And you can take, a hard disk out of a computer and you put a different one in and it has completely different memories of what's happened. That's not how our memory works. It's much more diffuse than that. Beer hypothesizes that maybe there are like chemical remnants that are stored in various levels of the body and can be recalled when necessary. Which is more similar to like the way it's like, oh yeah, well, if you look at a running computer, you're going to have memory in your bus, you're going to have memory in your GPU, in the video memory, in your random access memory, in storage, in the CPU's compute task, like it's cache, actually it's everywhere. But when you turn it off, you have the long-term memory, which is maybe more like history or something, I don't know, or external memory we have. Okay, Matt, third creed.
Quickly on the memory stuff. This is really the part that actually is like a little bit outdated, because he says that everything gets stored, and now we know that's actually not true. Like, memory is an active process. If a cop interrogates you the right way, you actually will remember running the red light. It's probably closer to something like how they do video, where there are keyframes and there are delta frames. It's probably there are little things that are seeds, and then they can get reconstructed and reblown up.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of how on really old video games they couldn't actually store all the data on disk. So they wrote an algorithm that would generate the appropriate data from a seed. So it's like there's the seed, there's the algorithm that works on it, and then your machine is going to generate on demand what was there, because you can't actually store the data verbatim on disk and use it. Third Creed, go ahead.
I was just going to say it was so much like some of the structure defining memory. It's like when RAM, the flip flops, they flopped a certain way in the past, and now they're flopped that way, or like a river delta, as you were saying, or water. Now it's in that structure, and the memory is being diffused as being like the structure is now what it is, and when you run the substance through it, it'll become what it's supposed to be. But then there's also that like conscious history writing process or like relationship with the past, where you're trying to and so there's like both the structural institutional memory, and then there's the conscious institutional memory where you go back and write your history about revise that, and they both kind of exist and are often in tension with each other.
Yeah, like, we can see history in some ways as like, or like, social sense making as being like an attempt to deal with the deficiencies of our memory that Matt brought up. They're not perfect, but they're an attempt. Shane, go ahead.
There's one sort of very interesting angle on this memory thing from a computational angle, right? And like an information theoretic angle. And it's actually related to what you just described, Kyle, with the generative algorithms, right? That like, if you have a given lump of data, there is probably a combination of an algorithm and a seed that is informationally equivalent, but might be a lot smaller. So basically, like you have this huge block of data, but instead of storing the damn thing, you can store the algorithm that would generate the data, and it can often be that algorithm is a lot smaller. So the digits of pi are a seemingly infinite size, and yet you can write an algorithm in a couple of lines of Python. So you have a choice between infinite bits or, a couple of bytes, like which one of those do you want to store? You want to store that one. This gives us some kind of insight into how this kind of compression goes about happening, right? Like, how is it that you actually get this much detail out of something that appears to be fairly small? It turns out that, like, informationally, you can do a lot of really tricky stuff to kind of store equivalent terms, or store and then recombine equivalent terms that are like equivalent to massively larger sets of data. So it's not the case that the brain is just juggling all the data raw. It's probably juggling some bizarre, like, compressed representations that are encoded in chemical strands. But they're information theoretically equivalent. It's kind of fucking weird,
Right. Yeah, and I mean, I guess the main thing there is like, you can have degradation of the seed, or you could, and you need an arbitrary amount of energy to reproduce whatever is seeded to some given definition. Like however many digits of pi you want, that's how much energy you're going to have to put in to get that out of the seed. Okay, cool. We have the discussion of the brain as an electrochemical computer. Just kind of some facts. Just kind of trying to blow your mind with like, hey, your brain has this wattage. Did you know that? Wow. Like we can describe your brain in physicalist terms. Okay, but then we get to this interesting part. Now it's easier to think about the brain as a computer than to think about the electronic computer itself as some kind of brain. And I remember from when I was doing my research on information society theory and sort of like early computing in the 50s, this was a really big discussion that was going on. The electronic brain, it was really common to talk about computers in that way as brains. So it was very much criticized for good reasons. The program computer is itself not very brain-like. Yet the typical modern computer configuration can be designed as an integral assemblage of specialized computers, and they can be arranged hierarchically. What was said about in part one about hierarchies of command, which have already been seen in relation to management systems, is now very much to the point. We can certainly envisage a central command axis inside the firm. Indeed, we can identify it in terms of men and procedures. If this were automated, we should have an analog of the spinal cord, collecting information and taking, he's literally saying this is an analogy. This is an analog. Collecting information and undertaking lower-level action on the lateral command axis. The ascending information would eventually reach the firm's central computer, where a part of the configuration would be needed to integrate the activities of all the branches and functions. This part of the configuration would be the analog of the brainstem, and there would be a cortical level part of the configuration in which the role of consciousness is played by senior management. Between these two would come all the sorting, switching, and relaying associated with the diencephalon and the basal ganglia. So what he's saying is like the computer in itself is not much like a brain. But if you combined an architected arrangement of computers, like, subsystems composing a whole computing system, with a social dimension, then you probably have something that's like a brain. The computer itself is not much like one. A programmed computer is not much like one. But if you add a social dimension into this arrangement, then you get something like a brain. Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, there's just a wonderful kind of irony in that like you start out with this like, oh, the computer is an electronic brain. It's like no. It's the other way around. The brain is an organic computer. Like that's the kind of analogy allows itself to flip around, and it's like, oh, okay. We see that computation is a general feature of the world, and this thing here is the most complex computer that's ever been known, and it's fucking scary how good it is at doing that compared to this fucking IBM piece of shit that we have in the corner here,
Right. So to sort of clarify that, like, if we think about like basic von Neumann machines, like von Neumann automata, as computers, those are not brains. Right? They're very, very simple. They're not brains. But you can aggregate and create increasingly sophisticated computers that are like brains. It's just, brains are at a different level of complexity than any given computer. So it's not why it's not appropriate to say that computers are brains, because there's just a mismatch there. Okay. All right. So then we get the sort of sketch. Jake, go ahead.
Oh, I was just wondering about, it just came into my head about cognition not even necessarily just being in the brain, and like talking about something not being a brain, like an assemblage of computers being a brain. Like, it reminds me of like the whole story about situated embodied cognition, and whether an assemblage of computers, maybe you could say that is embodied in the world in some way, more than you could say like a single computer sitting on its own in the corner of a room is embodied. And then, so cognition is like more than, the walnut.
Right. Yeah, that's definitely the way that Buer means it when he talks about brains. Is it's not just the walnut; it's everything in the sensory system. Okay, and that's where we're going to get to the brain of the firm. But literally right here. So we have the 5-level hierarchy of systems. He does say this is an arbitrary number that he's come up with, but he's basically has like a functional disagreement with the physiologist, the neurophysiologist of his time, saying like, yeah, they might say there's like 6, but from my standpoint of control theory, this looks like 5. There's a lot of sort of like physiological minutia here. the thing that stood out the most to me was the thalamus. His discussion of the thalamus here, but the thalamus is not actually listed on Figure 14, which is a curious omission. But if we go back, we can see. Is this listed at all in the Figure 13, the general layout? Not really, right? So anyone, the sides of the diencephalon are the thalami, sometimes thought as the brain's switchboard. Anyone want to clarify where the thalamus falls in this 5-step diagram? Okay. It's time for Wikipedia, everyone. Got to access external memory here.
There we go with the extended cognition, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yep. For anyone that wasn't familiar with that whole embodied and extended cognition thing, it's basically the idea that, say, for example, a spider kind of computes some of its cognition via its web. That it institutes computational kind of structures in the structure of its web, and the web does the thinking on its behalf, more or less. I mean, we do the same shit with notebooks and stuff, or with Wikipedia in this case. So that the cognition isn't really localized inside the walnut. That's the scary part of that, right? That it's a much distributed phenomenon rather than being my thoughts are directly located in my head,
Yes. So to get to that question of the thalamus, if I'm reading this correctly, I believe control echelon 4 and 3 would be the thalamus.
So it's the system 3-4 boundary, right?
Yes. I believe that is what is being referred to there. Third Creed, go ahead.
Just going to say that in that paragraph, he includes it in the third echelon. He says the three echelons is the diencephalon with the thalami and basal ganglia. Third of these three echelons is the diencephalon with the thalami and basal ganglia.
Okay, but isn't that in control echelon 4 on this diagram where it says diencephalon?
Yeah, is it different or did I read it wrong?
Let's see. Okay. The cord itself is the lowest. The medulla and pons are grouped together next. The third of these three echelons is the diencephalon, with the thalami and ganglia. The third of these three
So it's the third of the upper.
Third of the middle three, which would be the fourth. This is not the best rating, I have to say.
Yeah, it's true.
So that would count as the fourth.
If we look at figure, yeah, it would do, right? Because in figure 14, the spinal column bit is system 2, and then the M-pons and med-sur.
I see it
it's
now.
Control echelon 3, right? That's system 3.
Yeah,
and then system 4 is the diencephalon base.
I took a closer look at this brain diagram, and the thalamus, yes, should be in control echelon 4. Okay, so the physiology...
The thalami attached to the diencephalon.
Yeah, the physiology, the diagram, and the text match up. It is in control echelon 4. Okay, that was something I was very confused about. Thanks for clearing that up. Okay. Then we have the fifth level, which is the cortical level. He gets into this talk about how all the sensory nerves report to the thalamus. Everything that the cortex gets is sorted and switched through the diencephalon and the basal ganglia, our fourth level. In orthodox management talk, this level has nothing to do with command. In our model, it has everything to do with command. It lies smack on the vertical axis itself. This fact repays much reflection. After all, are not those very senior staff men and their officers commanders in disguise? What matters to the firm's top management is not so much the facts as the facts as presented. And the presentation chosen can govern the outcome of even the most important and well-considered decision. So he has this example here from Decision and Control of the junior clerk and how they arrange the table determining the level 5 outcome. But I think that, the obvious example that comes to mind here is, we started out this year with Trump's assassination of that general, was Soleimani, right? And apparently the reason why this happened is because someone who is preparing a PowerPoint presentation for Trump's briefing thought that they needed an extra action item on the slide in order for it to have a pleasing aesthetic appearance. And so they put the assassination option on there, thinking that no one would actually choose that. And so that, the system for people could be like, well, and of course, Mr. President, there is this ridiculous option over here, the one you wouldn't choose. But nevertheless, it is on the slide. And Trump was like, yeah, I like that one. And then so were all of his coterie of close advisors. They're like, yeah, let's kill that guy. That sounds good. So very much what Beer is describing here, the decision was actually largely made by someone working with PowerPoint. Matt, go ahead.
And I really like also how he's not using this language, but I think he's also getting into the social division of labor versus the technical division of labor, and how there are things that maybe it actually in terms of your experience of what you're doing, it seems very different than management work. But you are doing Clara, who wrote the Organizing for Power piece, posted a thing to me yesterday of Althusser talking about this, and it's super interesting. And it is interesting where the line is, because sometimes these sort of organizing roles, are management in disguise. But also, the flip side is also true. I'm thinking of project managers where I've had some really, really helpful project managers, but they have no authority. It actually is management as, as a technical skill, as opposed to being a manager in terms of the social division of labor. And
Yeah, Marx was onto something. It's good to know. Let's go to Jeremy and then Shane.
Okay, I have a question because I'm not familiar with 1970s management theory. I don't know what the orthodox line-staff dichotomy means. Does anyone know?
Yeah, it's essentially the idea that you have line officers and staff officers, and never the two shall meet, right? So the staff are making general decisions, and the line are implementing those decisions and making sort of low-level decisions. So it's based on the military, where you have line officers and then the general staff in that old French model of military structure, where the general staff tends to make large decisions and very strongly direct the entire military enterprise, whereas you can have something that's more like the American model, I guess contemporarily, but also kind of historically, where that distinction is less strictly maintained. But it seems like that line staff distinction was really strongly implemented into management philosophy at the time that Beer was working. Okay, Shane, go ahead.
Yeah, I think this stuff here is really, really interesting, right? Because it's we usually think of like the cortex, right, like level 5 as being where all the decision is going on, but in Beer's kind of working out of this system 4, the middle brain, is this like ultra dense, complex network matrix of decision making, and that's where a lot of the real smarts are. And it's interesting that we get that's often obscured to us, though. Like when my midbrain lights up and says I want to get McDonald's, I think I as a subject make that decision, right? Like, when not really, it's my midbrain that did it. And same with organizational stuff, right? Like we think that kind of like cephalic bias again, right? Of thinking of like the CEO as being the person who makes the decisions, but really it's this kind of fairly obscure middle layer of folks who are kind of making a lot of the decision that actually matters, right? It's very reminiscent of Yes Minister, the TV show, where the ministers are kind of side characters, and it's the permanent secretaries to the departments are the real power. Like, but they're hidden behind this firewall of these disposable goons that go to Parliament, right? Like the real decision making happens behind the scenes in this kind of deeply tangled network.
The deputy ministers, right?
Deputy ministers, exactly.
Yeah.
It's interesting how decision is obscured, right? Like, I mean, even the Soleimani example is really on point there. Like the actual decision making there is weirder than you'd expect, right? But like, I think we like to believe that no, Trump as a subject decided this course of action was appropriate because of good reasons. Like, this is this kind of rationalist kind of bias. But no, it's just this fucked up kind of accident of like the real decision was putting the bullet point on the PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, I mean, Trump is maybe a deficient System 5 and can't separate the signal from the noise, and so made a rather erratic decision. I don't know if it was a good one from the perspective of the American state. It seems to have honestly worked out pretty well for America, but definitely goes against what System 4 had envisioned for what would happen in that meeting. Okay, Jake and then Lauren.
It's just a kind of comment on a kind of where I have in terms of the way not anyone here, but some people might interpret some of the words he has. Like the second paragraph on page 92, he talks about like voluntary action being something that comes from like higher level brain structures in some kind of sense. Mm-hmm. And when I read that, it's maybe not exactly what he meant, but I imagined like the management, like, ooh, like perking up, or like, I can imagine certain left groupings taking that in a certain kind of way as well. And it also made me think of like in your Moore conversation, how like there's nature and then there's, human society, like in terms of like voluntary action being human stuff, and then, the kinds of people that are cast out into nature, right? I can imagine that happening within like an organization, maybe like a communist party, where the central committee does the voluntary decisions and guides the sheep, and they just do all their activist work or whatever.
Right. It's just that, it's easily misread as basically being what you described, which is the line staff model. That's what that model is, right? The voluntary actions taken by the general staff, the rest of people execute it. But that's of course not what Beer's describing here. I think he's just describing it in like kind of like physiological terms, like how brain scientists might talk about voluntary action. But it's Lauren, go ahead.
Just to touch on Shane's point, what that brought to mind was when that decision making between systems breaks down. Because like I used to work as a policy analyst in national government, advising the Minister for the Environment, and there were like at least 2 or 3 times where our minister, who wasn't like good at his job, would say like, "Oh, I want advice on X," and we'd be like, "No, that's silly. It'll get outed into the public. You'll look terrible. Like, we're not doing that." And then we'd, of course, like frame that in very polite policy language, would send that back to him, and then he'd just go and ask another team. So like, it just created so much inefficiency when that decision making was very unclear, like sort of between systems and who had the authority to do it and not and stuff.
System 5 is floating off in its own direction. Okay, and Matt.
Yeah, and just on the idea of like where does like a like a party stand in relation to the VSM? Yeah, I think there is something a little bit of a core of something there, just because the idea that without some sort of organization kind of keeping them. Keeping their eye on the ball, unions probably will just develop into trade union consciousness and just get stuck into System 2 stuff and System 1 stuff, and just and then get the rug pulled out from under them, like American unions in the 70s. Versus when you actually do have like a party acting as like a System 3 or 4, and coordinating efforts between different groups, that's why some groups seized power and some groups didn't. I mean, obviously, I think Bolsheviks are probably a little incomplete there, but I think that there's a little bit of a nugget to something to that structure.
Yeah, I think the basic point about trade union consciousness is pretty well taken, because the function of a trade union, you see this in the Russian Revolution and the debates that were happening there, is the workers at the trade union level don't really give a shit about revolution initially. There's a lot of propagandizing that happens, and then that starts to diffuse through the trade union organizations and the union of unions and that kind of stuff. So I definitely see that point. I mean, I don't know how exactly relevant it is to the American situation, because there were a lot of Leninist organizations that were very militant and active in the 70s, that were trying to do the thing that we're describing here, but overall didn't take control of the union movement and were basically crushed. So I don't know. I mean, it's that's a specific example. Did Shane disappear? No, Shane has just turned off their video. I think you had something to say there, Shane?
I did, and then my fucking browser kind of crashed, but I'm back. Yeah, I think it was kind of riffing on, I think, Matt's point and kind of emphasizing a thing here in Beer, that he's kind of drawing attention to this kind of System 4 thing as being extremely important, and the ways in which it's important can often be obscured. And I think for a lot of organizations, it's the presence or absence of strong System 4 that kind of makes or breaks it. That an organization might be operationally fairly okay in all these other ways, but have a completely lobotomized midbrain, and that's the thing that's probably going to kill it in a lot of ways, right? It's an extremely important part of the system. It's much more important than Level 5. Level 5 is kind of a sideshow that just kind of sets a very general policy of steer this way or steer that way. All the real action is in 3 and 4. That's where you need to be paying a lot of attention. The cortex is kind of who cares? It's down in the midbrain where the cool stuff's going on.
Right. It may be the case that levels 1 to 3 are maybe a little bit easier to articulate, and level 4 is quite difficult to articulate well. Because it's not so much that level 4 is more important than those lower levels, but what you're saying, where it's like an organization that's really atrophied level 4 fails, is a good point. And it's like you don't often see that many good level 4s. So maybe that's the point there. I
think the difference really is that level 4 is where the dynamism and the kind of interaction with the future is, right? That you can get levels 1 through 3 fairly right, and it's like, well, you're on easy street for the moment, right? But if you don't have a good System 4, if you don't have this dynamically adaptive, predictive machinery that's capable of making all these crazy decisions, then it's going to fall apart eventually.
Well, because you're just subject to environmental vagaries to some level, right?
Yeah. The next wave that comes along will just smash you. Exactly.
Yeah. Jeremy, go ahead.
Sorry about that. The dog needed to go out. The Beer warns that, I think in Heart of Enterprise, Beer warns that a lot of corporations and large firms don't have a conscious system 4 at all. And he says that when that happens, the big risk is that 5 will drop into 3, and you'll just have a 1, 2, 3 system and nothing else, which he calls a decerebrated cat. The idea that you can take a cat and sever its cerebrum from the rest of the cat, and the cat will still have all of its autonomic functions working, but it's effectively a dead cat. And so he basically says that without a system 4, either system 5 flies off and just does something else, or it just falls into system 3, takes on the system 3 functionality and just gives up on system 5 functionality, killing any chances of system 4 functionality when doing it. When I was at Metaforum, one of the people I met there, Ian Kendrick was his name. He says that for him, the single most important thing in his analysis of systems is to figure out what the 3-4 balance is, that he thinks that's the single most important task, and that everything falls into place when you figure out how 3 and 4 balance each other. Because 3 is really the integral part of the 1, 2, 3 cycle. And 4 is the integral part of the 3, 4, 5 cycle. And that both those cycles need to be in harmony with each other. And that's the 3-4 balance. It's the trickiest thing, but it's the most important.
Right. What you're describing there in terms of the decerebrated cat, is also like people who are brain dead. And it's quite interesting that, like, in our society, brain death has become an increasingly important medical question because we are better able to keep people alive, right, than we used to be able to. And brain death wasn't really much of a concern in previous decades. But because we're better able to keep people alive, it's become an enormous ethical question in medical ethics, whether a brain-dead person should be allowed to die or not. And I think that kind of has an analogy, in a sense, with what we have in the kind of like remnants or refuse of Keynesianism, where we have many so-called zombie corporations that are being kept alive on life support. They have no system 4 functionally, and they're just kind of there to keep their stakeholders going. So it's very interesting that the medical situation sort of parallels the social situation in some ways, in terms of like the body politic and then the human body. Shane, and then Lauren.
Mm-hmm. Just a very sort of maybe a throwaway kind of question, but like think of socialist politics in the 20th century. How many of those institutions were basically in that kind of decerebrated state, and eventually keeled over because that's what a decerebrated organism is going to do? Or how many of our kind of institutions right now are basically in that state that they don't have that layer at all? Like they barely have functioning system 1s, and all that kind of stuff up the spinal column is missing. And is that perhaps the biggest kind of like meta challenge of resurrecting or restarting a lot of a major mass socialist politics, is re-enervating these kinds of like systems all the way up the column? And what do we need to be on guard against? Like a union ideology or whatever, which would kind of forbid us from actually kind of having those kind of like deeply integral kind of loops at that high level. It's worth pondering, right? Like what state are we actually in? Is the DSA actually a kind of viable system, or is it perhaps in somewhere near this decerebrated thing? It's worth juggling.
Right. I am working with many futures people right now, with sort of like futurists and futures practitioners and, you know, sustainability people and, you know, green transition, all that kind of stuff. And I think that what Jeremy was saying about System 5 collapsing into System 3 without the presence of System 4 describes very well what's happening in Alberta right now, where Lauren and I are living, because the total lack of foresight that was, like, you know, be able to develop and be exercised in the government here has now led to a catastrophic situation where it's like the environment's changed. There's no plan. There's no adaptation capability. The only thing we can do is like a mewling baby, or, you know, like a little birdlet, just, you know, chirp chirp and ask for money from the federal government, because we don't have any capacity to do anything other than maintain basic bodily functions and ingest, you know, federal dollars. So that's you know, like that, but that speaks to me a bit about why it's so hard to do futuring here, because, like, the System 5 has collapsed into System 3, and so it's kind of become hyper stable in a very kind of like amoeba sort of like level. You know, it's not really operating at a higher level of cerebration. So trying to introduce that into the system is like, well, where does that plug in? Like, we don't have a plug for that. Okay, Laura, go ahead, and then Jake.
Yeah, just to sort of go back to the dead cat scenario, and this is where I'm sort of sense checking, but to me that sounds like times in my life where either I've said this or other people in my company have said this, where they've gone, if I quit, we're fucked. Like, if, like, in the sense that they are like the system, like if they go, then yeah, you've lost your System 4 or 3 and like those sort of crucial components, because it's so, what's what I'm looking for? Kind of like the informal process that you've done to compensate for the fact that you don't have like a System 3 or 4.
Yeah, it's like a really maladaptive System 4 that's very, very fragile and specialized. You know, whereas our brains have like lots of subsystems that interact to form System 4. If you just had like a single processor, a single organ that did that, you have one point of failure, and then it means that it both means that you have one point of failure, but it also means that that system is unlikely to actually like divide itself up into anything else, because it's an organ. You know, it's a body with organs, in the worst sense of the word. It's body with an organ. Okay, Jake, go ahead.
Yeah, as for socialist politics in the 21st century, I sort of imagine it as less of an issue of which systems are in place and more of like the boundaries of the system. Like some things just aren't in the system. Like, so like a lot of parties, like they're each their own individual system for one, not to even start on like the whole fact that the labor movement isn't inside the system. And like, should that come first? That's a whole different thing, right? But some socialist parties to me almost seem like they're like the System 4, like all they do is like simulate a System 4 that isn't really a System 4. Like all they're doing is thinking about the future in this kind of fucked up, projecting a crappy past onto the future that doesn't really even make any kind of consistent sort of sense. And they're so messed up internally that like the System 2 and 3 don't even seem to be working that well. And it just really kind of seems like they're trying to do a System 4 without even really having like the boundaries of the system right, the System 2 right, the System 3 right, or anything really. It's just like, yeah, role-playing a nice System 4 in the context of just like a desolated organization otherwise.
Yeah. Anyway, I could get into that, but let's keep going. Jeremy, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry not to go into rabbit hole there, but
So 2 observations. One from the heart of enterprise. Beer was talking about system 2 in this case, but applies equally to system 4. I mean, Beer basically thinks that systems 2 and 4 are the ones most likely to be ignored by the corporation. And he gives an example of a corporation system 2 being a Thursday morning coffee that a bunch of the different foremen on the shop floor go to, along with the logistics people and a few other people. And at that coffee, they discuss what's going on with everything. And this one company was like, you shouldn't be having coffee on Thursday. You all take too long. And then the entire corporation collapses because absolutely essential functioning was happening at that coffee. And when they banned the coffee, the whole thing fell apart.
For the want of a coffee break.
Yeah. Because no one was doing that. No one was doing that formally, and they were doing it informally. And, I think, when we think, or not we, but when in the public perception, when you think of who the innovators are, what the real system 4s are, you get these like tech, Silicon Valley tech bro ideas, and a lot of them are just batshit insane. And part of it is that System 4 depends upon an accurate model of the entire system. And if it doesn't have an accurate model of the entire system, it's just going to spout nonsense. And, you think about like these, Y Combinator meetings where they're like, what would be great if there weren't bodegas anymore, and instead of neighborhood shops, we had a smartphone app. And you're like, that's just madness. And even if it worked, you'd ruin the local economy, and the local culture. It's like the models that they have are based on being young, male, incredibly spoiled, incredibly upper middle class, incredibly cerebral, and then just project that onto the entire universe.
Oh yeah, definitely. That's definitely a very good point, and something that's like a real danger in futures as well. Like in futuring, I think a lot of futures work comes out of like, more like action research and this kind of thing. It's less like Ayn Rand, libertarianism nonsense, but there's a lot of tendency to do futuring and do future scenarios without a lot of connection to the understanding of the organization, and then subsequently producing something that's of no real value, even though the methods of the futuring process itself were sound. Okay, Shane, and then I think we're going to have to wrap because we're coming up on time here.
Mm-hmm. We very are. Just on the thing about like the system 2 being, implemented by accident in these kind of like informal kind of networks amongst layers of production, which is often how things turn out, right? And like management comes in and just severs it, or even they move one department to a different building, and suddenly this like lateral cross connection is accidentally cut, and then a year later the company's dead and they don't even realize what the fuck happened. Think about this coronavirus fucking lockdown shit, right? And so many, not just companies, but like institutions and all sorts of stuff have now had their kind of nervous systems completely obliterated because all of that informal cross-connective stuff that was happening just in person by accident, water cooler conversations and stuff is completely gone. Because if you don't have a formalized idea of what your system 2 is, all that stuff is just by accident. Like it's going to be there, but it's accidental. The promise of this kind of, and the same goes for like left organizing as well, right? Like the promise of this kind of modeling is that we could understand what that stuff actually is and actually guard it or cultivate it or grow a better version of it. Whereas if you don't even understand that your organization has its own nervous system, these things are going to happen to you. And it's like, well, how the fuck did this thing die? What happened? We don't understand. Well, of course, like nobody could possibly understand without first having an understanding of the organization as an organism. If you lose your fucking nervous system, you're kind of done for at that level, right?
Yep, for sure. Just before we wrap, I did like this little dig at the Catholic Church. In the Catholic Church, the activity of the Roman Curia has likewise been seen to play a major part in command, although command is supposedly vested in a synod of bishops working to an infallible commander. So, you know, I guess this is maybe what after Beer has left Catholicism is you know, 'cause, no, he's still a Catholic at this time. So he's like we're in the reform mode more so than in the post-Catholic mode. Okay.
He stayed a Catholic his whole life.
Oh, did he? Interesting.
Yeah. He converted to Catholicism to marry his first wife and then just stayed in it.
Okay. Well, that's how it happens for many. You just stay in it. Well, I would be interested to read more about that for sure. Because I think he was certainly a rather heterodox Catholic. But next time we're going to be talking about patterns. We're getting to what's the autonomy. We're talking about autonomy next chapter. That's a good topic. Let's talk about that. So we'll be reading that chapter for next time. Thanks for participating, everybody. And I look forward to seeing you next week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.